Welcome to Unit 3, A Practical Guide to Policy Analysis. In this unit, we're going to be talking about policy analysis, which is different than regulatory analysis that we've been discussing the prior two units. And so this is really a very abbreviated guide to how to do policy analysis based on a book called The Eightfold Path. And I'm just going to go over what sort of the 8 steps are in a policy analysis set forth in that book. And you have a summary of it in your readings. The book is too long to assign for this course, but if you're interested in policy analysis, then I would strongly recommend you read that book. So the Eightfold Path sets forth 8 steps in doing policy analysis, and an overview of those steps is defining the problem, assembling some evidence, constructing the alternatives, so different policy options, selecting the criteria for evaluating those alternatives, projecting the outcomes, confronting the trade-offs, then making a decision about what option you're going to pick, and lastly, telling your story. And we'll talk a little bit about what each of these means. So in defining the problem, you want to think about issues of deficit and excess, whether government intervention is necessary, what rhetoric would be most persuasive. If it's possible to quantify the problem, you would want to do so. Diagnosing the conditions that cause the problem is useful, and so is identifying latent opportunities, not just problems. You don't want to define the solution as the problem, or use the solution to define the problem. And then you want to iterate, which means repeat this process and revisit the problem definition several times as you go through the policy analysis. The second step involves assembling evidence. So this involves thinking versus collecting data and information. And thinking is more important to do at this stage, and collecting data is more time-consuming at this point. So you'll obviously want to review any available literature on the problem you're addressing, survey best practices of how people are handling it, and think critically about accepted problem definitions and preferred solutions. And this should be started very early on in the process, this assembly of evidence. Third, you want to construct the alternatives. So just like with regulatory analysis, where it's important to think of different regulatory options and to evaluate each one of those, with policy analysis, you want to come up with several alternative policy proposals, and they may not be mutually exclusive. So you may be able to do more than one of them. But start with a broad list of options and then narrow it down, and consider the different alternatives that political actors or policy makers are currently proposing. And try to design alternatives that may be better than the ones being discussed. It's important to consider all of the dimensions of a problem in considering a new policy. The fourth step is selecting the criteria by which you're going to evaluate these alternative options. So how will you measure the outcomes and impacts of each alternative? And some of the criteria that are commonly used by policy analysts include efficacy, so that means maximizing the net benefits, similar to what we discuss in cost-benefit analysis. It could also be maximizing the public interest for something that's not quantifiable or cannot be monetized, expressed in terms of money. So equity, equality, fairness, or justice are outcomes or impacts that usually can't qualify but may be important to consider. Other values could be freedom, community, or process values. And then there's also practical criteria to consider. So what's the administrative feasibility? How easy is it to actually do this thing? And also, what's the political feasibility? So is this something that politically could actually happen? The fifth step involves projecting the outcomes. So you want to evaluate each policy alternative based on the criteria that you've selected, to see if you can eliminate alternatives that don't produce the desired outcomes and impacts. If it's possible to quantify sort of the magnitude of the impacts, that can be very useful. You may also want to do a break-even estimate. So similar to the threshold analysis we discussed in Unit 1 under cost-benefit analysis. And you can construct a matrix to basically explore these different outcomes in a systemic way or visualize them. Step 6 involves confronting the trade-offs. And so at this point, you want to focus on outcomes, not inputs and outputs. And you might see dominance, which is when one policy is better on all of the important outcomes. Often you don't have that, but when you do, then you have a clear solution. And this is also a time to revisit those break-even estimates. Step 7 is to decide which of these policy alternatives you're going to use or choose. And in doing that, you always want to stop and ask yourself, well, if this is really the best policy, why hasn't it been implemented already? And that's just a way to go back and rethink to make sure you've considered really all of the aspects of this policy. If there's something that seems like too good to be true, a really obvious solution that no one has thought of yet, maybe it's actually not a great solution. Maybe it's not really practicable, can't be implemented, or maybe there's actually some aspect of it that you haven't taken into consideration. The last step is, we call it tell your story, but it basically means communicating the process, your process that you followed, and your recommendation clearly. And the book, the Eightfold Path book, mentions 3 types of audiences. So one is an audience that will spend only 30 seconds reading your analysis, which is probably most policymakers. Another will be people who will spend 3 minutes. And the third will be people who will spend a full 30 minutes looking at your analysis. And you want to make sure that your analysis provides enough information to satisfy all 3 types of readers. So that concludes Unit 3 on policy analysis. And at the end of this week, also remember to do your regulatory analysis assignment, or your regulation assignment, sorry, I mean to say. And then next week, week 6, we'll turn to judicial review of agency interpretations. Thanks.